The heart monitor screeched, a shrill, jagged cry that tore through the dimness of room 305 at Mercy Hospital. Clara Bennett, just 8 years old, lay motionless, her tiny chest barely rising beneath the tangle of wires. Rain lashed the window, a relentless drumbeat against the glass, as if the Savannah night itself wept for her failing heart. Eleanor Bennett clutched her daughter's cold hand, her sobs swallowed by the storm's roar, while Thomas stood frozen, his eyes locked on the flickering green line. Each weak beep felt like a countdown. Then Jasper, their golden retriever, lifted his head from Clara's bedside, his gaze piercing the gloom with an eerie intensity. Something was about to shift. Hope you enjoy this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Rain battered the old oak outside, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky, casting twisted shadows across the worn wooden floor of the hospital room. The air inside hung heavy, thick with the sting of antiseptic and the damp, earthy scent seeping through a cracked window pane. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced Clara's knuckles, the girl's skin pale as the moon hidden behind storm clouds. Her daughter's breaths came shallow, each one a fragile thread stretched too thin, ready to snap. She couldn't look at Thomas. Not yet. His silence was louder than the rain, a weight pressing against her chest, threatening to crush what little hope remained. Thomas stood by the foot of the bed, his broad shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded jacket. He stared at the heart monitor, its green line stuttering like a candle flame in the wind. Every dip and falter carved a new line into his weathered face, aging him beyond his 42 years. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything to ease Eleanor's pain, but the words lodged in his throat, sharp and useless. He remembered the day Clara was born, her first cry echoing through their Savannah home like a promise. Now, that promise teetered on the edge of silence. Jasper lay sprawled across the floor, his golden fur matted from hours of stillness, his snout resting on Clara's dangling hand. The dog had refused to leave her side since they'd arrived at Mercy 3 days ago. His loyalty a quiet rebellion against the sterile chaos of tubes and machines. His deep brown eyes, usually bright with the joy of chasing squirrels through Savannah's fields, now glinted with something else, something Thomas couldn't name. It wasn't fear, nor exhaustion, but a knowing that sent a shiver down his spine. Jasper's ears twitched as thunder rumbled, low and mournful, rolling across the Georgia lowlands. Eleanor's mind churned, replaying the past week like a broken record. Clara had been fine. Just a little tired, she'd said after playing by the river. Then came the cough, the fever, the collapse on their porch steps. The diagnosis, congenital heart failure, worsened by a sudden infection, had hit like a freight train. Dr. Sullivan had warned them it was a long shot, but tonight's prognosis was a death knell. She glanced at the pecan pie, sitting untouched back home, baked for Clara's return that now seemed impossible. The thought twisted her stomach, a bitter ache beneath her ribs. The door creaked open and Dr. Henry Sullivan stepped in, his white coat rumpled, his face etched with the kind of weariness only late-night rounds could bring. He carried a clipboard, but his hands hung loose, as if the weight of his words made it too heavy to hold. The room stilled, even the rain seeming to hush as he approached. Eleanor's heart thudded, a frantic counterpoint to Clara's fading rhythm. Thomas turned, his jaw tight, bracing for the inevitable. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Sullivan began, his voice low, cracking slightly on the edges. "We've done everything we can. Her heart's too weak to keep going. It's only a matter of hours now." He paused, his gray eyes meeting Eleanor's, then Thomas's, searching for a way to soften the blow. There was none. "You should say what you need to say." Eleanor's knees buckled and she sank into the chair beside Clara, a keening sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. Thomas stepped forward, his hand hovering over her shoulder, then dropping. He couldn't touch her. Not yet. The truth was a blade slicing through the fragile wall they'd built around their hope. Hours. Not days, not weeks, but hours. The word echoed in his skull, drowning out the rain, the monitor, everything but Clara's shallow breaths. Jasper shifted, his massive frame rising slightly as he pressed his snout harder against Clara's hand. His eyes flicked to the window where lightning briefly illuminated the oak silhouette, then back to the girl. Eleanor noticed the movement, her tear-streaked face turning to the dog. "Jasper," she whispered, her voice raw. "You know, don't you?" The dog didn't bark, didn't whimper, just stared, his gaze steady and deep as if he held a secret the humans couldn't grasp. Thomas watched Jasper too, a memory flickering through his mind. Years ago, when they'd found the pup shivering by the Savannah River, Clara, barely 3, had giggled and claimed him as her own. "He's mine forever," she'd said, her chubby hands buried in his fur. Forever had felt real then, an endless stretch of summers and riverbank romps. Now it was shrinking to this rain-soaked night, this dim room, this final goodbye. Dr. Sullivan lingered, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I'll give you some time," he said, stepping back toward the door. "If you need me, just call." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the family alone with the storm and their grief. Eleanor reached for Thomas's hand, her fingers icy against his calloused palm. "We can't lose her," she choked out. "Not like this." Thomas squeezed her hand, his throat burning. "I know," he managed, though he didn't know how to fight this, how to pull Clara back from the edge. He looked at her small form, the way her dark curls spilled across the pillow, the way her chest fought for every breath. Then his eyes drifted to Jasper, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. The dog's stillness was unnerving, a contrast to the chaos inside Thomas's chest. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window pane, and the oak groaned as if bearing witness to their pain. Eleanor leaned closer to Clara, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Stay with us, baby," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Please stay." Clara didn't stir, her face peaceful yet distant, as if she'd already begun to drift beyond their reach. But Jasper, he didn't relent. His ears twitched again, and he let out a soft, low whine, barely audible over the rain. Thomas frowned, stepping closer. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice rough. Jasper's head tilted, his eyes catching a faint gleam from the storm's light. It was fleeting, but it struck Thomas like a spark. Something was stirring, something beyond the machines and the doctor's words. Eleanor saw it too, her breath catching. "Thomas," she whispered, "he's not given up." She didn't know what it meant, couldn't name the feeling swelling in her chest, but Jasper's gaze held her like an anchor. The room, once a prison of despair, trembled with a new tension, a thread of mystery, fragile and unformed, pulling them toward the unknown. The heart monitor beeped again, weaker still, but Jasper's eyes stayed locked on Clara, unwavering. Outside, the rain pounded harder, a rhythm of sorrow and secrets yet to unfold. The rain had stopped, leaving only the drip of water from the oak's leaves. Outside, room 305. Midnight cloaked Mercy Hospital in stillness, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the occasional creak of a nurse's cart down the hall. A full moon rose high, its silver light slicing through the blinds, painting streaks across the wooden floor. Clara lay still, her small chest rising and falling with effort, the heart monitor's weak beeps a fragile lifeline in the quiet. Eleanor sat hunched in her chair, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red and raw from crying. Thomas stood by the window, staring at the moon as if it might hold answers he couldn't find. Jasper stirred. The golden retriever lifted his head from Clara's bedside, his ears perking up as if catching a sound no one else could hear. His deep brown eyes fixed on the window, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made them glow. Too bright, too alive for the dimness of the room. Eleanor noticed first, her breath catching as she watched him rise, his massive frame slow but deliberate. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Look at him." Thomas turned, his brow furrowing. Jasper wasn't pacing or whining. He just stood, statue-like, staring at the moon with an intensity that sent a chill through the air. The heart monitor faltered. A single beep stretched too long, then erupted into a chaotic screech, shattering the silence. Clara's body twitched, her pale face tightening as if in pain. Eleanor bolted upright, her chair scraping the floor. "No, no!" she cried, her hands flying to Clara's shoulders. Thomas lunged toward the call button, slamming it with his palm. "Doctor, hurry!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The monitor's wails filled the room, a relentless alarm that drowned out the thudding of Eleanor's heart. She pressed her forehead to Clara's, whispering, "Stay with me, baby, please." Footsteps pounded down the hall and the door burst open. Yvette Margaret rushed in, her silver hair askew, her nurse's apron flapping. Behind her came Dr. Sullivan, his face tight with urgency. "What's happening?" he barked, shoving past Thomas to reach the bedside. Yvette's hands moved fast, checking wires and adjusting the monitor, her lips murmuring a prayer under her breath. But before anyone could act, Jasper moved. With a soft grunt, he leaped onto the bed, his heavy body landing beside Clara. He pressed himself against her, his golden fur brushing her arm, his snout nudging her cheek. "Get that dog off!" Dr. Sullivan snapped, reaching for Jasper's collar. Eleanor grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "No! Don't! He's all we have left!" Her voice broke, raw with desperation, her eyes pleading. Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised. "Let him stay," he said, quieter but firm. "Please." Dr. Sullivan hesitated, his jaw clenching, but he relented, stepping back with a sharp nod. Yvette glanced at him, then at Jasper, her weathered face softening as if she understood something the doctor didn't. Jasper lay still, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. The room held its breath with him, Eleanor's hands trembling, Thomas's fists clenched, the medical team poised in tense silence. Outside, the moon glowed brighter, its light spilling over the bed, bathing Clara and Jasper in a pale sheen. Yvette hummed faintly, an old hymn her grandmother had sung in Savannah's clapper churches, her voice a thread of calm amid the storm. Dr. Sullivan stared at the monitor, his fingers tightening around his clipboard, waiting for the inevitable. But the inevitable didn't come. The monitor's screeches softened, the jagged lines smoothing into a steady rhythm. Clara's breathing deepened, a faint color creeping into her cheeks. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Thomas blinked as if waking from a dream, his eyes darting between his daughter and the dog. Jasper didn't move, his warmth seeping into Clara, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. The room trembled with something unspoken, a shift, a spark, a mystery no one could name. Room 305 buzzed with frantic energy, the moonlight now a silent witness to the chaos unfolding beneath it. Clara's heart monitor beeped steadily, a fragile but persistent pulse that defied the grim hours before. Dr. Sullivan stood over her, his stethoscope pressed to her chest, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Yvette Margaret adjusted the CEV line, her hands steady, despite the tremor in her voice as she murmured, "Lord have mercy, I've never seen this." Eleanor knelt by the bed, her fingers tangled in Clara's curls, tears streaming down her face. Thomas hovered behind her, his breath ragged, his eyes locked on Jasper. The golden retriever lay pressed against Clara, his massive body a shield against the tangle of wires and tubes. His fur rose and fell with slow, heavy breaths, each one seeming to sync with the monitor's rhythm. Dr. Sullivan straightened, his clipboard clattering onto the bedside table. "Get that dog off the bed!" he ordered, his tone sharp with irritation. "This isn't sanitary." He reached for Jasper, but Eleanor's hand shot out, seizing his wrist. "No!" she cried, her voice a jagged edge of desperation. "Please let him stay. He's all we have." Thomas stepped forward, his broad frame blocking the doctor's path. "She's right," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "He's not hurting her. Look at her." He gestured to Clara, whose chest rose more evenly now, her face less pinched with pain. Dr. Sullivan's eyes narrowed, flicking between the parents and the monitor. He opened his mouth to argue, then shut it, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't expect me to explain this." Yvette moved to Clara's other side, her hands brushing the girl's forehead. "She's warmer," she said softly, her southern drawl thick with wonder. "A minute ago she was cold as clay." She glanced at Jasper, her lips curving into a faint smile. "My old hound did this once. Lay by my boy till the fever broke. Dogs know things we don't." Eleanor looked up at her, gratitude flashing through her grief. Thomas nodded, his mind racing back to the riverbank where they'd found Jasper, a shivering pup who'd chosen them as much as they'd chosen him. Dr. Sullivan adjusted the monitor, his movements brisk, almost angry. "Her vitals are stabilizing," he said, his tone clipped. "I don't know how, but they are." He scribbled something on his clipboard, his pen scratching loudly in the quieting room. "We'll need to run tests, figure out what's happening." He didn't look at Jasper, but his eyes lingered on the dog's stillness, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Science was his anchor, yet here it wavered, unsteady in the face of something he couldn't chart. Eleanor's sobs broke into a choked laugh, her hands cupping Clara's face. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder, his own tears welling up as he watched his daughter's eyelids flutter. Then, a miracle. Clara's eyes opened, pale blue and hazy, searching the room. Her gaze landed on Jasper and her lips moved, faint as a breath. "Jasper," she rasped, "you're here." The room froze. Eleanor gasped, pressing her forehead to Clara's. "Oh, baby!" she cried, her voice a flood of joy and fear. Thomas sank to his knees beside the bed, his hand finding Jasper's fur, rough and warm under his fingers. "She's awake," he said, as if saying it aloud made it real. Yvette clasped her hands, her hymn faltering into a quiet chuckle. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, shaking her head. Dr. Sullivan stared, his clipboard forgotten, his mouth parting in silent astonishment. Jasper didn't move, his head resting on Clara's arm, his eyes half closed now. His breathing slowed, a deep rhythmic sigh that seemed to pull the room into its calm. Eleanor noticed, her joy dimming as she studied him. "Thomas," she whispered, "he's so still." Thomas nodded, a knot tightening in his chest. He didn't understand, not yet, but he felt it. Something had shifted, something Jasper had given, something they couldn't repay. Outside, the moon hung high, its light softening as clouds drifted across its face. The oak stood sentinel, its branches dripping with the last of the rain, bearing witness to a night that defied reason. Clara's voice, weak but alive, lingered in the air, a thread pulling them toward the unknown. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of room 305, casting golden stripes across the oak floor of Mercy Hospital. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet that felt fragile, as if the world held its breath. Clara sat propped against her pillows, her cheeks flushed with a hint of color, her blue eyes brighter than they'd been in days. The heart monitor beeped steadily now, a rhythm that anchored Eleanor's frayed nerves. She sat beside her daughter, brushing Clara's dark curls, her hand still trembling from the night's ordeal. Thomas leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching them with a mixture of relief and unease. Jasper lay sprawled on the floor beside the bed, his golden fur dull in the light, his chest rising slowly. He hadn't moved since Clara woke, his snout resting near her dangling hand, his eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity. Eleanor glanced at him, her heart twisting. "He's exhausted," she murmured, her voice soft but thick with worry. Thomas nodded, stepping closer. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday," he said, crouching to run a hand over Jasper's head. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his gaze from Clara. Clara's voice broke the stillness, faint but clear. "Mama, he was with me," she said, her small hand reaching for Jasper. Eleanor leaned in, her breath catching. "What do you mean, baby?" she asked, her fingers tightening around Clara's. The girl's eyes flickered as if peering into a memory. "In the dark," she whispered. "It was cold and I was scared, but Jasper was there. He wouldn't let me go." Her words hung in the air, simple yet heavy, a child's truth that defied the sterile logic of the hospital room. Thomas swallowed hard, his hand stilling on Jasper's fur. He met Eleanor's gaze, seeing the same question mirrored in her eyes. What had happened in those desperate hours? He wanted to dismiss it as a dream, a fevered vision. But Jasper's presence, his uncanny timing, gnawed at him. "He's more than a dog," he said quietly, echoing his thoughts from the night before. Eleanor nodded, tears welling up. "He brought her back," she said, her voice breaking. "Somehow he did." The door creaked open and Yvette Margaret stepped in, carrying a tray with a cup of coffee and a damp cloth. Her silver hair gleamed in the sunlight and her smile was warm, though her eyes carried the weight of years. "Morning, y'all," she said, her southern drawl a soothing balm. She set the tray down and moved to Clara's side, pressing the cloth to the girl's forehead. "You're looking better, sugar," she said, then glanced at Jasper. "And you, big fella, you're a hero, ain't you?" Eleanor managed a shaky smile. "He is," she said. "Yvette last night, he wouldn't leave her." And then she woke up. Yvette's hands paused, her expression softening. "I've seen it before," she said, her voice low. "Years back my hound lay by my boy when he had pneumonia. Didn't move till he opened his eyes. Dogs got a way of knowing, loving us more than we deserve. She chuckled, but her eyes glistened, a memory stirring behind them. Thomas listened, his mind drifting to the river bank where they'd found Jasper, a muddy, shivering pup Clara had claimed with a laugh. He'd been their shadow ever since, chasing fireflies in their backyard, sleeping at Clara's feet. Now that bond felt deeper, a thread tying them to something he couldn't name. "He's our angel," Eleanor said, echoing Yvette's sentiment, her hand resting on Jasper's head. The dog sighed, a deep, weary sound, and Thomas frowned. "He's not himself," he said. "He's too still." Yvette nodded, her gaze sharpening. "He's worn out, poor thing. Giving all he's got, I reckon." She straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "I'll fetch him some water. See if he'll take it." She slipped out, leaving the family in a quiet that felt heavier now. Clara reached down, her fingers brushing Jasper's ear. "Don't be tired," she said softly. "You're my best friend." Jasper's eyes flickered, meeting hers, and for a moment they held a spark, then dimmed again. Eleanor watched, her chest tightening. "Thomas," she whispered, "he's giving too much." Thomas didn't answer, but he felt it too, a shift, a cost they couldn't measure. Outside a mockingbird trilled, its song sharp against the morning's calm, a reminder of Savannah's endless summers. But in room 305, time felt finite, and Jasper's stillness cast a shadow over their fragile joy. The hospital garden glowed under the mid-morning sun, the ancient oak spreading its branches wide, dappling the grass with shade. Mercy Hospital's walls faded behind them as Clara stepped outside, her small frame supported by Eleanor's arm. She wore a thin gown, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders, her steps slow but determined. Thomas followed, carrying a blanket and a slice of cornbread he'd made the week before. His mother's recipe, a gesture of thanks for Yvette. Jasper trailed behind, his gait sluggish, his golden fur catching the light as he stayed close to Clara. Clara's face lit up as they reached the oak. "Can we sit here?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Eleanor nodded, spreading the blanket beneath the tree's canopy. "Of course, baby," she said, helping Clara settle onto the soft fabric. Thomas knelt beside them, his eyes scanning the garden, the wet grass, the distant hum of cicadas, the faint scent of earth after last night's rain. It was a slice of Savannah he'd missed, a breath of normalcy, after days trapped in room 305. Jasper flopped down beside Clara, his head resting on her lap. She giggled, a sound that pierced Eleanor's heart with bittersweet joy, and wrapped her arms around him. "Don't be tired, okay?" she said, her fingers sinking into his fur. "You're my hero." Jasper's tail thumped once, weakly, but his eyes stayed half-closed, his breathing slow and labored. Eleanor watched, her smile fading. "He's not right, Thomas," she murmured, her hand hovering over the dog's back. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "I know," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread and offering it to Jasper. The dog sniffed it but didn't move, his gaze fixed on Clara. "He hasn't been since last night," Thomas added, his voice low. He thought of Clara's words, Jasper in the dark pulling her back, and a chill crept up his spine. What had the dog done? What had he given? He couldn't shake the feeling that Jasper's strength was fading, slipping away with every breath Clara gained. A figure approached from across the garden. Joe Carter, an elderly patient with a cane and a weathered face. His hospital gown fluttered as he shuffled toward them, his eyes bright with curiosity. "That's your girl," he called, nodding at Clara. Thomas stood, offering a hand to steady him. Yes, sir, he said. Clara. Joe grinned, easing onto a nearby bench. Heard she took a turn last night, and that dog, heard he's something special. Eleanor glanced at Jasper, then at Joe. He is, she said softly. He wouldn't leave her. Then she woke up. Joe chuckled, a raspy sound. Ain't surprised, that dog's got a heart bigger 'n this oak. My old mutt once dragged me out of a ditch, loyal to the end. He tapped his cane on the ground, his gaze lingering on Jasper. Looks wore out, though. Given all he's got, I reckon. Clara looked up, her hand still on Jasper. He's my best friend, she said, her voice firm. He's not going anywhere. Joe's smile softened, but his eyes held a knowing glint that made Thomas uneasy. Hope you're right, little miss, he said, tipping an imaginary hat. He rose, shuffling back toward the hospital, leaving the family in the Oak's quiet embrace. Eleanor handed the cornbread to Thomas. Give this to Yvette later, she said, her voice steadying. She's been a blessing. Thomas nodded, but his eyes stayed on Jasper, whose head sank deeper into Clara's lap. The garden felt peaceful. Too peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension coiling inside him. Clara hummed a tune, her fingers tracing Jasper's ears, oblivious to the shadow creeping over her parents' faces. The cicadas buzzed louder, a savannah symphony, but beneath the oak a question lingered unspoken. How much had Jasper given, and how much did he have left? Night settled over room 305 at Mercy Hospital, the moonlight filtering through the blinds in thin silver slivers. The storm's echoes had faded, replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the fields beyond Savannah. Clara sat up in bed, her small hands tracing the edges of a coloring book, her cheeks rosy with a warmth that had been absent for days. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a quiet reassurance that held Eleanor together as she sat beside her daughter, knitting a scarf she'd started weeks ago. Thomas stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the glass, his eyes tracking the moon's slow climb. Jasper lay on the floor, his golden bulk pressed against the bed's edge, his snout near Clara's dangling hand. He hadn't moved much since the garden, his breathing slow and heavy, each rise of his chest a labor. Eleanor's needles clicked rhythmically, but her gaze kept drifting to him, her brow creasing with worry. He's not eating, she said softly, setting the knitting aside. Thomas turned, his hands in his pockets, his face shadowed. I tried earlier. Water, food, nothing, he said, his voice tight. He just looks at her. Clara glanced down, her crayons pausing. He's okay, Mama, she said, her tone firm despite its softness. He's just resting. She reached for Jasper, her fingers brushing his ear, and he sighed, a deep, weary sound that made Eleanor's chest ache. She knelt beside him, her hand smoothing his fur. What have you done for us, sweet boy? She whispered, tears welling up. His eyes met hers, dim but steady, and she felt a pang she couldn't name, a gratitude laced with dread. Thomas crouched next to her, his calloused hand resting on Jasper's flank. He's giving too much, he said, echoing her unspoken fear. He thought of the garden, Joe's words about loyalty, and Clara's story of the dark. It wasn't just exhaustion. Jasper was fading, a light dimming as Clara's grew brighter. He didn't know how to say it, didn't want to, but the truth pressed against his ribs like a stone. He brought her back, Eleanor said, her voice breaking, but at what cost? The door opened and Dr. Sullivan stepped in. His white coat crisp despite the late hour. He carried a chart, his expression a mix of relief and confusion. Evening, he said, nodding at them. He moved to Clara's side, checking the monitor, then her pulse. "She's improving. Faster than I'd have thought possible," he said, his tone clipped but tinged with wonder. "Her vitals are strong, her fever's gone. We'll need more tests, but it's remarkable." Eleanor managed to smile, her hand still on Jasper. "She woke up last night," she said, "right after—" She trailed off, glancing at the dog. Dr. Sullivan followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "The dog," he said, more to himself than to them. He scribbled a note, then looked up. "I can't explain it. None of this makes sense by the book, but she's stable. That's what matters." He hesitated, then added, "Keep an eye on him, though. He doesn't look good." Thomas nodded, his throat dry. "We will," he said, though he knew they couldn't fix what was happening. Dr. Sullivan left, the door clicking shut, and the room sank back into its quiet tension. Clara hummed softly, coloring a picture of a dog that looked like Jasper, her innocence a shield against the weight her parents carried. Eleanor picked up her knitting again, but her hand shook, the needle slipping. "He's our miracle," she said almost to herself, "but he's slipping away." Thomas stood, moving back to the window. The moon hung high, its light catching the magnolia trees outside, their blossoms pale against the dark. He remembered his grandmother's stories, tales of dogs who loved so fiercely they gave their all, passed down in Savannah's porches and kitchens. He'd laughed then, a boy with no use for old wives' tales. Now those stories felt real, etched into Jasper's tired frame. "He's fighting for her," he said, his voice rough. "Even now." Clara looked up, her crayons clattering onto the tray. "He's my best friend," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "He's not going anywhere." She leaned down, resting her cheek on Jasper's head, and he let out another sigh, softer this time. Eleanor watched tears spilling over, and Thomas turned away, his fists clenching. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of magnolias, a fleeting comfort against the growing shadow in room 305. The clock in room 305 ticked past midnight, its hands glowing faintly in the dark. Moonlight waned through the blinds, casting long shadows across the oak floor, and the hospital hummed with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Clara slept, her breathing even, her small form curled beneath a blanket Eleanor had tucked around her. The heart monitor's steady beep was a lifeline, a sound that held the family together after days of chaos. Eleanor sat beside the bed, her knitting abandoned, her hands clasped in her lap. Thomas paced quietly, his boots soft against the wood, his mind restless. Jasper lay beside Clara, his golden fur barely rising with each breath, his eyes half open in the dimness. He hadn't moved since she'd fallen asleep, his snout pressed to her hand, a silent guard in the night. Eleanor watched him, her heart heavy. "He's weaker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas stopped pacing, crouching beside the dog. He ran a hand over Jasper's side, feeling the slow thud of his heart. "He's hanging on," he said, though doubt crept into his words. "For her." Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked, then smiled faintly at Jasper. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She reached for him, her small hand wrapping around his paw. "Stay with me, okay?" Jasper's tail thumped once, a feeble motion, and he licked her fingers, his tongue warm but slow. Eleanor's breath caught, a sob rising in her throat. "He's trying so hard," she said, her hands covering her face. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. He sat beside her, pulling her close. Remember when we found him? He asked, his voice low. Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. By the river, she said. Clara was 3. She laughed so hard when he shook mud all over her. The memory flickered between them. A sunny day, the Savannah River glinting, Jasper bounding into their lives like a gift. She said he was hers forever, Thomas added, his gaze on the dog. He's keepin' that promise. Eleanor leaned into him, her tears soaking his shirt. He is, she whispered, but he's breaking my heart. They sat in silence, the weight of Jasper's loyalty pressing down. Clara's voice broke through again. Soft, but clear. He's my hero, she said, her hand still on his paw. He saved me. She yawned, her eyes drifting shut, and Eleanor stroked her hair, her touch tender. He did, baby, she said, her voice trembling. He's our hero. Thomas watched, a lump in his throat, knowing Clara didn't see what they did. Jasper's fading light, the cost of her miracle. We'll take care of him, he said suddenly, his tone firm. If she pulls through, if she's okay, we'll make sure he's okay too. Eleanor looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. You mean it? She asked. He nodded, gripping her hand. He's family. We owe him everything. It was a vow, spoken into the quiet, a promise to fight for the dog who'd fought for them. Jasper's eyes flickered, meeting Thomas's, and for a moment they held a spark, then dimmed, heavy with exhaustion. Thomas rose, kneeling beside Jasper. You've given us everything, boy, he whispered, his hand smoothing the dog's fur. Thank you. Jasper sighed again, a sound that carried years of love, and Thomas felt it. A bond beyond words, a sacrifice unfolding before them. Eleanor joined him, her fingers tracing Jasper's ear. Rest now, she said, her voice cracking. We've got you. Outside, the wind rustled the magnolias, their scent drifting through the cracked window, a fleeting sweetness in the night. Clara slept on, her breathing a quiet rhythm, while Jasper stayed by her side, his presence a fading tether. The room held its breath, poised between miracle and loss, and the family clung to their promise, uncertain of what dawn would bring. The hospital garden lay cloaked in the faint gray of pre-dawn, the moon sinking low beyond the horizon. The ancient oak stood silent, its branches still, the air thick with the damp scent of grass and the distant hum of Savannah's waking fields. Thomas stepped outside, his boots crunching softly on the path, Jasper cradled in his arms. The golden retriever's head rested against his chest, his breathing shallow, his golden fur catching the last traces of moonlight. Room 305 had grown too small, too heavy, and Thomas needed air, needed to feel something beyond the suffocating weight of the night. He eased Jasper onto the grass beneath the oak, the dog's body limp but warm. Jasper's eyes opened briefly, meeting Thomas's, with a serenity that pierced him. You're tired, boy, Thomas said, his voice rough, kneeling beside him. He ran a hand over Jasper's flank, feeling the slow thud of his heart, each beat a quiet echo of the promise they'd made hours ago. The garden was still, save for the rustle of leaves and the faint chirp of crickets, a peace that felt wrong, too gentle for the storm brewing in his chest. Inside, Eleanor sat by Clara's bed, her hands clasped tightly as she watched her daughter sleep. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a lifeline she clung to, but her eyes kept drifting to the empty space where Jasper had lain. Clara stirred, her small hand reaching out, then falling back as she murmured, Jasper. Eleanor's throat tightened, tears spilling over. She'd seen Thomas leave with the dog, a silent understanding passing between them. He needed this moment, and she needed to stay. Back in the garden, Thomas sat cross-legged, his hands resting on his knees. "You've done so much," he said, his voice breaking. "You brought her back to us." Jasper's tail thumped once, a weak flicker of life, and Thomas choked on a sob. He thought of the riverbank, Clara's laughter, the years of Jasper's unwavering presence. Summers by the porch, winters curled by the fireplace. Now that presence was fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. He wiped his eyes, his breath hitching as Jasper licked his hand, a final gentle touch. In room 305, Clara's eyes fluttered open, her gaze searching the room. "Mama," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. Eleanor leaned in, brushing a curl from her forehead. "I'm here, baby," she said, forcing a smile. Clara frowned, her hand patting the bed. "Where's Jasper?" she asked, her tone insistent. Eleanor hesitated, her heart sinking. "He's with Daddy," she said, her voice trembling. "They're taking a walk." Clara nodded, accepting it, and reached for her crayons, pulling a half-finished drawing from the tray. Outside, Jasper's eyes closed, his breathing slowing to a faint rhythm. Thomas leaned down, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "You're telling me something, aren't you?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Why does it feel like goodbye?" Jasper's chest stilled, a final sigh escaping him, and Thomas froze, the silence deafening. He clutched the dog's fur, a low wail breaking from his throat, raw and unrestrained. The garden held him, the oak a mute witness to a loss that cut deeper than words. Clara's crayons scratched across the paper, her small tongue poking out as she worked. Eleanor watched, her hands trembling until Clara held up the drawing, Jasper standing beneath the oak bathed in light. "He's happy," Clara said, her eyes bright. "He told me not to cry." Eleanor's breath caught, a sob escaping her as she pulled Clara close. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice muffled against her daughter's hair. She didn't understand, couldn't, but Clara's words were a lifeline, a fragile comfort against the ache. Thomas stumbled back into room 305, his arms empty, his face streaked with tears. Eleanor looked up, her eyes widening, and she knew. She rose, crossing the room in 3 steps, and collapsed into his embrace, her sobs shaking them both. "He's gone," Thomas rasped, his voice hollow. "He just stopped." Clara watched, her drawing slipping to the floor, her small face crumpling. "Jasper?" she asked, her voice breaking. Thomas nodded, unable to speak, and Eleanor knelt by her, pulling her into their arms. The room filled with their grief, a tangle of love and loss, as the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds. Outside, the oak stood tall, its shadow stretching across the garden where Jasper lay, a silent guardian no more. Sunlight flooded room 305, spilling over the oak floor and warming the air with the promise of a new day. The heart monitor's steady beep was a quiet hymn, a testament to Clara's fragile strength, as she sat up in bed, her dark curls tangled from sleep. Eleanor stood by her side, adjusting the pillows, her eyes red but dry, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. Thomas lingered near the window, his gaze fixed on the garden below, where Jasper's absence left a void he couldn't face. The morning was bright, too bright, a cruel contrast to the shadow that had settled over them. Clara clutched Jasper's collar, the leather worn and warm in her small hands. "He's gone," she said softly, her voice trembling but certain. Eleanor nodded, sitting beside her, her fingers brushing Clara's cheek. "He is, baby," she said, her tone gentle. "He stayed as long as he could." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't sob. just held the collar tighter, as if it could anchor her to him. "He finished his job," she said, echoing her words from the night. "He saved me." Thomas turned, his throat tight, and crossed to the bed. He knelt beside Clara, his hand covering hers over the collar. "He did," he said, his voice rough. "He was the best friend we could have asked for." Clara looked up, her blue eyes searching his, and nodded. "I'll miss him," she whispered, and Thomas pulled her close, his arms trembling as he held her. Eleanor joined them, her hand resting on Thomas's shoulder, a silent circle of grief and gratitude. The door opened, and Dr. Sullivan stepped in, his white coat crisp, his face a mask of professional calm. He carried a chart, flipping through it as he approached. "Morning," he said, his tone brisk. He checked Clara's vitals, his stethoscope cold against her skin, then stepped back, his brow furrowing. "She's doing better than I expected," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Her heart's stronger, strong enough to go home soon if this keeps up." He paused, glancing at the empty spot by the bed. "I don't know what happened last night, but it worked." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "It was Jasper," she said, her voice steady now. "He wouldn't leave her." Dr. Sullivan nodded, his skepticism softening. "I can't argue with results," he said, scribbling a note. "We'll do a final round of tests, but she's clear for discharge in a day or two." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry about the dog. He must have been special." Thomas nodded, unable to speak, and the doctor left, the door clicking shut behind him. Yvette Margaret slipped in moments later, her silver hair tucked under a cap, her arms carrying a small bouquet of magnolias. "Thought these might brighten things," she said, setting them on the table. She moved to Clara, brushing a hand over her forehead. "You're a fighter, Sugar," she said, then looked at Eleanor and Thomas. "And that dog, he was your guardian angel, wasn't he?" Eleanor's eyes welled up, and she nodded. "He was," she said, her voice breaking. "We owe him everything." Yvette hugged her, her embrace warm and firm. "I've seen it before," she said softly. "Dogs give their hearts, sometimes more than we know." She pulled back, smiling at Clara. "He's proud of you, I reckon." "You rest now." She slipped out, leaving the family with the flower's sweet scent, a fleeting comfort in the sterile room. Clara traced the collar's edges, her tears falling silently, and Eleanor smoothed her hair, humming a lullaby she'd sung since Clara was a baby. Thomas returned to the window, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the oak where Jasper had lain. He saw a groundskeeper moving below, covering the spot with a tarp, and his chest tightened. "We'll take him home," he said suddenly, turning to Eleanor. "Bury him by the river. He'd like that." She nodded, her eyes meeting his, a shared resolve steadying them. Clara looked up, her voice small. "Can I say goodbye?" she asked. Thomas smiled, faint but real. "Of course, sweetheart," he said. "We all will." The morning stretched on, sunlight warming the room, and the family sat together, bound by loss and a miracle they couldn't explain. Outside, Savannah stirred, its fields golden under the rising sun, a world moving forward while they held tight to what they'd lost and what they'd gained. A week had passed since Clara's discharge from Mercy Hospital, and the Bennett home on Savannah's outskirts basked in the golden glow of a late afternoon. The wheat field beyond their porch swayed under a gentle breeze, its rustling a soft hymn to the quiet days that had followed their return. Clara sat on the porch swing, Jasper's collar looped around her wrist like a bracelet, the leather worn smooth from years of love. She held a sketchbook, her crayons scratching across the page as she drew Jasper running through the field, his golden fur bright against an endless sky. Eleanor stepped outside, a glass of sweet tea in hand, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. She settled beside Clara, the swing creaking under their weight, and watched her daughter's careful strokes. "That's beautiful, baby," she said, her voice soft but steady, the raw edge of grief dulled by time. Clara smiled, small but genuine. "He's happy now," she said, her eye fixed on the drawing. "He's running, like he used to by the river." Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening, and sipped her tea, the sweetness a faint comfort against the ache that lingered. Thomas emerged from the house, his boots dusty from a morning in the shed, a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. He leaned against the railing, his gaze drifting to the field. "Thought we could do something for him," he said, his tone casual but deliberate. "A fund. Maybe for the shelter down in town. Call it Jasper's Fund. Help dogs like him find homes." Eleanor looked up, her eyes brightening. "That's a good idea," she said, setting her glass down. "He'd like that, giving back, like he gave to us." Clara paused, her crayon hovering over the page. "Can we?" she asked, her voice eager. "I want to help dogs, too." Thomas crossed to her, ruffling her hair. "You bet, kiddo," he said, his smile faint but warm. "We'll start small. Visit the shelter, see what they need." Clara beamed, returning to her drawing with renewed energy, and Eleanor leaned into Thomas, her hand finding his. "It's perfect," she whispered. "A way to keep him with us." The screen door squeaked, and Rose Holloway stepped onto the porch, a pecan pie balanced in her hands. Her gray hair gleamed in the sunlight, and her warm eyes crinkled as she smiled. "Heard y'all were back," she said, her southern drawl thick with affection. "Thought I'd bring a little something." She set the pie on the table, its buttery scent mingling with the field's earthy aroma, and settled into a rocking chair. "How's our girl doing?" she asked, nodding at Clara. "Better every day," Eleanor said, her voice lifting. "She's strong, thanks to Jasper." Rose's smile softened, a knowing glint in her eyes. "That dog was a blessing," she said. "Reminds me of my old mutt, Scout. Saved my boy from a fever once. Lay by him 3 days straight till he woke. Dogs got a way of giving their hearts, don't they?" Thomas nodded, his chest tightening at the echo of their story. "They do," he said. "Jasper gave everything." Clara looked up, holding out her drawing. "This is him," she said, her voice proud. Rose took it, her hands trembling slightly, and studied the bright lines. "Well, ain't that something?" she murmured. "He's watching over y'all, I reckon." She handed it back, her gaze lingering on Clara. "You keep drawing, sugar. Keeps the good memories alive." Clara nodded, tucking the sketchbook close, and Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand, a shared resolve, settling between them. The afternoon stretched on, the sun dipping lower, painting the field in hues of amber and red. Thomas fetched a knife, slicing the pie, and they ate in companionable silence, the porch swing swaying gently. Rose rocked in her chair, humming a tune from her childhood, and Clara traced Jasper's collar with her fingertip, her thoughts drifting to the river where they'd bury him tomorrow. The field whispered around them, a quiet promise of healing, and the family felt the first stirrings of a purpose born from loss. The wheat field near the Bennett home glowed crimson under a savanna sunset, the sky streaked with gold and purple as the day faded. Clara stood at the field's edge, her small frame silhouetted against the horizon, Jasper's collar clutched in her hands. Eleanor and Thomas flanked her, a paper lantern resting on the grass between them, its fragile frame glowing faintly from the candle within. The air carried the distant strums of a guitar from a festival in town, a soft melody weaving through the rustling wheat, and the family stood in quiet reverence, poised to say goodbye. Clara knelt, her fingers tracing the collar's edges. "He's up there," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Running, like in my picture." She looked up at Eleanor, who nodded, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "He is, baby," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "He's happy now." Thomas crouched beside them, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder, his gaze on the lantern. "We'll send him something," he said, his voice rough. "Let him know we're okay." Eleanor lit the candle, her hand steady as the flame flickered to life. She remembered the night Jasper died, the garden, the oak, Thomas's broken cry, and felt a pang, sharp but fleeting. "He gave us you," she said to Clara, her eyes glistening. "That's what he'd want us to remember." Clara nodded, taking the lantern from her mother, and stood, her small arms lifting it toward the sky. "This is for you, Jasper," she whispered, releasing it, and the lantern rose, a glowing speck against the dusk. Thomas watched it climb, his chest tight with a mix of grief and peace. The breeze caught it, carrying it over the field, and he felt a nudge, not physical, but real, like Jasper's nose against his hand. He glanced at Eleanor, saw the same flicker in her eyes, and knew she felt it too. "He's still here," he said, his voice low, and she leaned into him, her arms slipping around his waist. "Always will be," she murmured, her breath warm against his shoulder. Clara stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth, and pointed as the lantern drifted higher. "Look, he's taking it," she said, her voice bright with wonder. The wheat swayed around them, a golden sea whispering secrets, and Thomas squeezed Eleanor's hand, a vow forming in his silence. They'd live for Jasper, honoring the love that had saved them. "We'll make him proud," he said, his tone resolute. "The fund, the shelter, all of it." Eleanor nodded, her tears falling freely now. She thought of Rose's pie, Yvette's flowers, the small acts of kindness that had carried them through the week. "We're not alone," she said, her voice steadying. "He brought us together, everyone." Clara turned, wrapping her arms around them both, and they stood as a unit, the lantern a fading glow above the field. The guitar strums grew fainter, blending with the wind, a savanna lullaby that wrapped around their grief. The sky darkened, stars peeking through the twilight, and the family lingered, reluctant to leave. Clara hummed softly, a tune she'd made up for Jasper, and Eleanor joined in, her voice trembling but clear. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, and pictured Jasper bounding through the wheat, free, joyful, forever theirs. The collar hung heavy in Clara's hands, a talisman of their bond, and she pressed it to her chest, her humming fading into the night. They turned back toward the house, the porch light a warm beacon against the growing dark. The field stretched behind them, vast and quiet, and the lantern vanished into the sky, a final farewell. Thomas held Eleanor close, Clara's hand in his, and they walked together, the weight of loss easing with each step. The festival's music drifted on, a thread of life beyond their sorrow, and they knew tomorrow would bring new purpose, a legacy waiting to unfold. 1 year had passed since Jasper's final breath beneath the Savannah moon, and the community center in downtown Savannah buzzed with life under a warm spring evening sky. The air carried the smoky tang of BBQ ribs sizzling on grills, the sweet aroma of pecan pie wafting from folding tables, and the faint hum of cicadas blending with laughter and chatter. The Jasper Fund launch had drawn a crowd, locals in plaid shirts and sundresses, shelter volunteers with clipboards, and a pack of rescued dogs scampering across the grass, their barks a joyful chorus. Clara stood at the heart of it all, now 9 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she clutched a microphone, her small frame steady atop a wooden crate. Eleanor and Thomas flanked her, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces a mix of pride and quiet sorrow. The community center's brick walls glowed orange in the sunset, its open lawn dotted with lanterns, small echoes of the one they'd released over the wheat field a year ago. Rose Holloway sat in a rocking chair near the stage, her gray hair gleaming under a wide-brimmed hat, her warm eyes fixed on Clara. Yvette Margaret mingled with the crowd, her silver hair tucked under a cap, a tray of sweet tea balanced in her hands. The night was alive, a celebration woven from loss, and the family felt Jasper's presence in every rustling leaf, every shared smile. Clara tapped the microphone, a faint squeal cutting through the noise, and the crowd hushed, turning to her. "Hi, everybody," she said, her voice clear despite a slight tremble. "I'm Clara Bennett, and this is for Jasper, my best friend." She held up his collar, the leather worn but polished, a talisman she'd carried since that dawn in the hospital garden. "He saved me when I was really sick. He stayed with me, even when he was tired, and then he went away. But he's why we're here, to help dogs like him find homes." The crowd murmured, a ripple of nods and soft gasps, and Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand, her eyes glistening. She remembered the night, in room 305, the monitor's screech, Jasper's leap, Clara's faint whisper, and felt a pang, sharp but softened by time. Thomas leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "She's doing great," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He thought of the riverbank where they had buried Jasper, the stone they'd carved with his name and the promise they'd kept. This fund, this night, a legacy born from love. Clara took a deep breath, her small hands steadying the microphone. "I was in the hospital a year ago," she continued, "and I almost didn't make it. But Jasper, he wouldn't let me go. He lay by me, and when I woke up, he was there. Then he got so tired and he left. I miss him every day, but I know he's happy now. He's running somewhere, watching us." Her voice cracked, but she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, and the crowd leaned in, hanging on her words. Rose dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her rocking chair creaking softly. "That girl's got a spirit," she murmured to Yvette, who nodded, setting her tray down to clap. "She does," Yvette said, her drawl thick with pride. "And that dog, he's still working miracles." She thought of her own hound, years gone, and the way Jasper's story echoed through Savannah's porches and kitchens, a tale passed from heart to heart. Thomas stepped forward, resting a hand on Clara's shoulder. "We started this fund for Jasper," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "He gave us everything, our girl, our family, and we want to give back. The shelter's taken in 20 dogs this year, and with your help, we'll find homes for more. Every dollar, every minute, it's for him." He paused, his throat tight, and Eleanor joined him, her voice steady. "He brought us together," she said. "Not just us, but all of you. That's what love does. It grows." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of warmth that washed over the lawn, and Clara beamed, stepping down to hug her parents. A shelter volunteer approached, a wiry woman named Lila, with a clipboard and a grin. "We've got a special one tonight," she said, gesturing to a cage nearby. She opened it, and a golden retriever pup tumbled out, its fur a shade lighter than Jasper's, its eyes wide and curious. "Found him by the river. Same spot you folks said you found yours." Eleanor's breath caught, and Thomas knelt, his hand outstretched. The pup bounded over, licking his fingers, and he laughed, a sound raw with memory. "Look at that," he said, glancing at Clara. "What do you think?" Clara crouched beside him, her eyes lighting up. "He's like Jasper," she said, her voice soft with wonder. She slipped the collar from her wrist, holding it up. "Can we give it to him?" Thomas nodded, and she fastened it around the pup's neck, her small hands trembling but sure. The crowd cooed, snapping photos, and Rose stood, her cane tapping the ground as she approached. "That's a fine choice," she said, her voice trembling with age and emotion. "He's got the same spark. I can see it." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small wooden carving, a dog beneath an oak, whittled by her late husband decades ago. "For you," she said, pressing it into Clara's hands. "Keep him close." Clara hugged her, the carving warm against her chest, and Eleanor wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness that had grown from their pain. Lila clapped her hands, drawing attention. "We've raised enough tonight to keep the shelter going 6 months, she announced, her grin widening. "And this little guy, he's got a home with the Bennets, if they'll have him." Thomas looked at Eleanor, a silent question, and she nodded, her smile breaking through her tears. "We'll take him," she said, and Clara squealed, wrapping her arms around the pup. "I'll call him Sonny," she said, "'cause he's bright like Jasper was." The night deepened, stars twinkling above the community center, and the crowd gathered around the grills, sharing plates of ribs and pie. Rose settled back in her chair, pulling a harmonica from her pocket, and began to play. A southern hymn, slow and soulful, its notes weaving through the chatter. Yvette joined in, her voice rising in harmony, and the crowd swayed, some singing, others listening. A communal heartbeat under the savannah sky. Eleanor watched, her hand in Thomas's, and felt a peace she hadn't known since Jasper's last sigh. Thomas lifted Sonny into his arms, the pup's warmth a faint echo of Jasper's, and carried him to Clara. "He's yours," he said, setting him down, and she giggled as Sonny nipped at her fingers. "He'll sleep by me," she said, "just like Jasper did." Eleanor knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her face. "He will," she said, her voice soft. "And Jasper, he's proud of you, of us." Clara nodded, her eyes on the pup, and Thomas felt a weight lift, a quiet closure settling over him. The hymn faded and the crowd clapped, Rose's harmonica glinting as she tucked it away. "That's for the dogs," she said, her voice carrying, "the ones who love us more'n we know." The lanterns flickered, their light dancing across the lawn, and the family stood together, Sonny at their feet, a new chapter beginning where an old one had closed. Thomas looked at Eleanor, then at Clara, and saw Jasper in their strength, their love, a legacy that stretched beyond the grave. They moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and thanks, the BBQ smoke curling into the night. Clara held Sonny's leash, her drawing of Jasper tucked under her arm, and Eleanor carried Rose's carving, a treasure to place by the river stone. The shelter dogs barked, their tails wagging, and the fun's promise hummed in the air, a lifeline for the lost, a tribute to the one who'd saved them. The stars burned bright, a canopy over Savannah, and the family knew this was the end of Jasper's story, and the start of something greater. As the night wound down, the crowd thinned, leaving the Bennets beneath the community center's oak, its branches a mirror to the one at Mercy. Clara yawned, Sonny curling up beside her, and Thomas wrapped an arm around Eleanor, pulling her close. "He's still here," he said, his voice steady, and she nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Always," she whispered, and they stood in silence, the world soft and whole around them. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.